Welcome to the STR Data Lab.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the STR Data Lab. I'm Jamie Lang, Chief Economist of AirDNA, and I'm joined today by a wonderful guest, Catherine Ratcliffe, the CEO of STR Benefits Consulting, Lost Together Stays, and the recent conference organizer of the CanStays Alliance Conference in Banff, Canada. Catherine, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Jamie. I really appreciate it.
So I want to dig into the conference. I want to dig into STR Benefits Consulting, sort of your experience in industry. But I just wanted to start with I had such a great time in Banff. I talked about it on last week's episode with Scott on just how great the conference was. And maybe I'll mention a few things that I just thought were different. And then maybe tee that up for the question for you of how did you go about doing this, thinking about the conference, sort of curating what you wanted, and then how did you see it sort of come together? And the two things that I noticed, one was you curated the content. I feel like you had in your mind how you wanted it to go, and then you got the people to come. You got them to talk about the things that you knew were going to be relevant for the audience. And that is just so different than many conferences that I've been to that it's oh, submit an idea of what you want to talk about, or we're going to give these 20 sponsors the time to really just talk about whatever they feel like talking today. And in some ways that can work. In other ways, this just works so much better. And then the second point was just the direct involvement with both national and local government officials, getting them there, getting their perspective on how the industry is evolving. There's sort of the connection between hosts, professional managers, and its impact on the government, how the government views them. It was just such great conversation. So I'll stop talking and maybe let you react, and then sort of go from there.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm glad you felt that, because it was very true. I said to a number of people, I felt like I got my doctoral degree in short-term rental content and sustainability in Canada. So I think the first thing for people to know is that I'm originally from Canada. And so there were some unique things that when you grow up in an environment, you just don't lose, right? So I grew up in Ottawa, which is the capital of the country. And so politically, you end up in, a vortex of always being in tune with governmental changes, regulations, watching advocacy in action, because everybody goes to the capital to protest or to, have their issues heard. And then I also, grew up in a household my father was American. He was from New York City. And my mother was from Toronto. So an Anglophone household during a lot of the French English language debates, the separation debate, and then having this, dual perspective of Canadian and American. So when you grow up in that environment, you're constantly drawing parallels and comparisons to those things. You can't help but have this fundamental ethos that Canada is different, it is unique, and it is not the 51st state. I think as a young adult, when I moved to Florida in my 20s, it was a very rash decision. And I made that mistake of thinking, I know what this is like because I have an American passport. So obviously I know everything about America. And then I had a very rude awakening when I got here. So that was in the background. That was the foundation of understanding it is different. And so, the fractures across the country, and the issues that come about. It just being married to an American, when you would ask me questions, it's like, well, we had Canadian content regulations, so we didn't get to read that book, or we read that book instead, or we watched that show instead. And those are fundamental pieces if you're going to have a successful business in Canada, whatever it is, that you have to understand those building blocks of how it works. And so that's what led me to say, okay, if we're going to talk about data, if we're going to talk about marketing and everything from tax regulations and finance, this has to be purely Canadian content. And I did work very hard on finding experts in those fields.
So what's, and maybe back up a bit, what brought you into the short-term rental industry?
So my mom died in 2017, and I live in Florida and she was in Canada. So there was this, I couldn't, go to any place that we had, memories and that sort of thing on a regular basis. And I wanted to create places for my kids. And there's this deafening silence that comes with grief, especially when you lose a parent, that it's just, you go to call them 100 times and they're not there. And so I needed to create sound, sound with my kids laughing and, discussing things other than my grief. And, the sounds that were in the background, the beach waves from the condo, which was my first acquisition, and then the rustling leaves in Georgia and my cabin property, those things became very, very important, making memories and then helping other people make memories. I had this incredible job. I was a large group employee benefits broker, and I dealt with a lot of data. I love data, but it was a lot of sad data. So it was sort of this grief upon grief. You're looking at pediatric cancer patients and all that sort of thing, and forecasting out their costs and their mortality tables. And so being able to help in a different aspect of saying, like, if you have 57 vacations in your lifetime, how do you make the most of them, and how can I help make sure that those are the best possible memories that you can make with your loved ones and friends and whatnot. And so that was the driver behind that. I bought the condo in 2017. My brother was on a federal political campaign in 2019, and I wanted just some space and peace. We also went through an M&A situation with my brokerage firm in 2020, and I said to my husband at one point, I said, I just want to be in the woods and talk to squirrels. That's where I want to be right now. So I want to find like the most remote place, because anybody who's been through an M&A transaction knows it's a lot. And then anybody who's ever been part of a political campaign as a sibling or someone else on the fringes, how invasive that can also feel. So I wanted peace and tranquility.
Well, I was looking at the website for Lost Together Stays, and I love the market you're in. Being in Atlanta, I feel like you're in like the two areas where I vacation with my family, like Blue Ridge, Georgia, down on the coast of Florida. So is that where you guys were finding yourselves vacationing? Like, how did you pick those markets?
So we started with the condo in Madeira Beach, and we were vacationing in Anna Maria, but Anna Maria was well outside my price range for what I could do. So, my kids would have loved it if I did something in Anna Maria. But on the other side of it, my risk management hat that comes on when you do have situations like red tide and, other things that kind of come up. Madeira Beach gives you more options for other things to do versus Anna Maria is pretty much strictly a beach community. Blue Ridge, Georgia, our first anniversary, we had gone to LJ, and I just absolutely loved the area. And it was a dream since then to have a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And then Homosassa, my brother-in-law had a place up there, and again, making those memories were really important. It's ridiculous because we both technically live in the Tampa Bay area, but with where he's at and where I'm at, and I'm sure you can appreciate this in Atlanta, it's just too much with traffic to get together locally. So we meet in Homosassa, which is silly, but that's what happens. And again, creating memories with the kids. They've learned how to drive a boat and how to fish and scallop and those types of things that you just don't get that time back. So, and then we have Ocala, which is by the equestrian center because my youngest daughter rides.
Oh, that's great. I'm actually under contract now to buy our first short-term rental up in North Georgia mountains. So we
Oh,
are
nice.
so excited. I've got a 3 and 6-year-old, so we are very much looking forward to having a space that we can sort of create those memories, but also rent it out and have the sort of income to offset it and have it be sort of long-term profitable. So getting back to the conference, because one, I suspect the things that you did to sort of make this a success weren't easy. Like that,
No.
there's a reason why it's not done, right?
Mhm.
So Can you help me understand the process of getting, maybe let's just start with one, getting government officials involved in the conference like you did? I know maybe with your connections and through the family, through your sort of history, maybe that helped, but like, how did that process go about? Like, even like getting the local DMO in Alberta to be part of the conference?
Mhm. So the unique thing with being from Ottawa is that like I wouldn't say everybody, but a huge portion of the population you grow up with goes into government.
Mhm.
And so there were a lot of people that I went to school with that these were relationships and, they ended up in politics and I ended up in insurance. And, I'm one of the few that moved away. There were a few others that moved away, but Ottawa is just this interesting incubator of it's sort of like the Kevin Bacon's 6 degrees of separation. Like when you go through who's from Ottawa, like Alanis Morissette went to my high school. She's 2 years ahead of me, and then she transferred over to Glebe. Matthew Perry was from Ottawa. Tom Cruise was in Ottawa. So it's like you have all of these people, and you have these weird memories of sitting carpet time in whatever it was, fourth grade or whatever, and you're talking about like, what does your dad do? And I remember Jason Turner saying one day, he's like, well, my dad was Prime Minister of Canada. And we were all just like, what? I mean, my dad worked in a newspaper. Okay, good for you. So it's this interesting incubator where you just know a lot of people. And one thing that I'm good at is building and maintaining relationships. And then, of course, I would go back. My mom was very active in politics. She long before, my brother got involved, and he did not help me. I have to be very clear on that. And it's not a slam on him. It's just one, he couldn't, just from an ethics perspective, but also anybody who knows him knows he's not great with outbound phone calls. so, um, so it was really just a grassroots effort of people that I knew, that I had built relationships with over the years. I had represented a number of DMOs here in Florida for their benefits. And there was an interesting relationship between, the DMO here in Orlando. And of course, they had worked very closely in Canada. And so just knowing the value of what they do and how they do that, it was important to me to include them. Because when you're talking about how do you become an ally as opposed to an adversary, you've got to figure out that win-win. And so that's where, I knew some of those strategies, looking at Matt Generu, who's an MP friend of mine and has been for a number of years, the topics that he covers, they're all looking for support. Help me, have talking points that fit my portfolio. And if I could deliver that, then that's a win for him. And he's more than happy to support me in those things. And so it's just going through and saying, all right, who covers, disabilities, who covers, emergency preparedness and supply chain and all these different things, and saying this is my value prop. So it was effectively a sales pitch to the politicians as much as it was to the vendors that were being asked to participate, and the property managers too, in helping them understand the value of coming, because it is not culturally something that Canadians do. They don't typically get together for conferences like that. The few that do participate in conferences go outside the country. And that was one of the toughest battles I had to deal with, because Canada, like several other governments, incentivizes you for educational travel. So if you're going to a conference in the US, you can file for a grant for it. But if you're going to a conference in Canada, you can't. So those were some nuances that I was beating my head against a wall with some of this. Where like, gosh, I cannot get Canadian content to take place in the US, and I want to support the Canadian economy with Canadian content. So there were some tough pieces to kind of navigate. But yeah, it did really, to me, I needed to find those allies that would be supportive of the initiative, rather than just saying, these are our property rights, this is our economic impact, this is why you need to let us exist, because it's just not the Canadian culture. That's not the way they think about things.
Let me sort of ask it this way, because there was definitely the elephant in the room that was the looming regulations coming into British Columbia. And I talked to multiple property managers that are just like, yeah, just lost 30 properties. Like, and they talked about it almost nonchalantly of like, yep, it happened. They're gone. Like we're moving on. We're figuring out how to continue to operate. But then there was also the sort of and maybe criticism of the local government of like,
Mhm.
they're sort of in their own bubble and they're not here. And we're trying to have the conversation. We're trying to figure out sort of the best way forward. And they're sort of not willing to engage. So do you have any sort of thoughts on just the regulation that's coming? And maybe sort of start with just like what is the regulation that's coming into effect? What, 2 days ago now? Yeah, May 1st. We're recording on May 3rd. And then how that came to be and sort of maybe what's next there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've said it a couple of times now. If America is a cruise ship, Canada is a flats boat with certain things, and change is easy to take place, good and bad. And that's the challenge, and that's why it was so important to have some really candid advocacy conversations. Members of the BC legislature were invited to participate, and they did not. What's interesting politically in Canada is you can have a member who wants to participate, who wants to come and be engaged and listen, but based on their party rules, the party has so much authority over you, they can tell you what you can and cannot do. So you don't have the same autonomy that you do in the US to just say, I want to go and listen to my constituents. If a whip or somebody else tells you you're not going to that, you're not going to that, right? Or they won't sign your papers to run in the next election. And the next election is actually in October provincially for British Columbia. So I think there was an element of that. You have a premier that, has some history there with, I think running things without a lot of thought. Like, this isn't the only weird issue that's taking place in British Columbia. There's a number. I think you're going to see some changes come about provincially with that. I think the arguments and the conversations that we were putting forward, they hadn't thought about, and it becomes very difficult to walk that back once you've said this is what it is and this is a housing crisis, and then all of a sudden we're addressing accessible accommodations and access to healthcare, and they didn't think about that. So there is an element of, if I show up, I'm going to be destroyed for not thinking about this. And I tried to be very clear that that was not the intention. I did not want anybody, regardless as to political affiliation, to feel attacked in coming. I wanted to be very clear. No one was to regret coming to that event, because we had people from different political parties. We had people that had histories of being across the aisles from each other, that, maybe were in a corporate environment now. And so we did not want to have any ugliness at all. This was, how do we work together? Let's focus on the things we agree on. So it was unfortunate that, there were folks that were unable to come from British Columbia. I think there will be change, and I think that there will be an opportunity for some of the regulation to be walked back. I know that has been a party stance by one of the political parties, that if they're elected, this will change. So, and then there's interpretations of the regulations. And we talked, a little bit about that with Airbnb, about whether you're supposed to cancel all reservations as of May 1st or not. And, so there's some differences there. I think there is a difference when you are a property manager versus the owner of that property. And it's a lot easier, I think, for a property manager to walk away, because they don't have the liability and the debt servicing that the property owner has. So that's where, it would have been nice to have had more participation from the property owners to come, because I think those are the ones that are really going to feel the pinch. A property manager can effectively take their model and go anywhere with it.
And you mentioned Airbnb, and I thought, one, it was amazing that Airbnb was a sponsor, but two, that Airbnb was so involved. Like Nathan Rutman, like, was front and center. Famously, like, Airbnb wasn't on stage at Verma International, but you had him engaged in multiple panels, multiple conversations, and it feels like, and from the outside, that Airbnb's involved in the right conversations with local governments, with the property managers, with individual hosts, and sort of telling the stories of who the industry actually is. So how did that sort of relationship come about?
So It honestly came about because I am very supportive of the human trafficking prevention efforts here in Florida. And industry wide, Airbnb is the only voice in that space. So, the Attorney General's event is May 17th. Outside of Airbnb, I'm going to be the only person there that has a short term rental interest. They have sponsored education for that in Florida. They gave a $100,000 grant. So they did a lot. So I spoke to the individuals that I work with here in that arena, and they connected me with Nathan because again, I spoke at VRMA International about human trafficking from a short-term rental perspective as well as an employer perspective, because a lot of people don't know what they don't know. And I didn't want it to be scary and overwhelming about, the really dark side of human trafficking, because it comes a lot in labor and where, people don't think of it showing up. And they also don't think of it from a positive perspective, that we're the eyes and ears of communities when people are at work and at school. And so we can actually help be part of the solution. So Nathan and I connected on that, and we talked about the opportunity for Airbnb partnering with me. And he said, how involved do you want me to be? And I said, very, very involved, because, I know there's a lot of shade that gets thrown on Airbnb, and I've been a guest and I've been a host, and, I see and feel those things too. But when you look across at all the different organizations that are involved in advocacy, they do a lot and they're more unified. There's a lot of fragmentation across other organizations that are touting their way as better. And what Airbnb does is meaningful and helpful. There was nothing in Canada for advocacy whatsoever. And Nathan had a lot of that inside track. He's done a lot of good work. He ends up on the defensive with everything. And so it was an opportunity. If somebody was going to tell the story about the good of short-term rentals, that really had to be, a huge part of Airbnb's involvement, because they have done so much with refugees, with evacuations, with the fires, with human trafficking and domestic violence situations where they've been on the front lines of helping people. And that story had to be told. Also, the access to healthcare component. It was disappointing because he actually called Expedia and Booking and said, you need to come. Like, he was very helpful in not just saying, hey, this is Airbnb and I'm going to, hold on to this. It was a very, like, let's get everybody together because we're all on the same page of this. And he was reaching out to different people on my behalf as well to help push this forward, which I think that deserves a lot of support and attention, because I think we're really quick to say Airbnb is the one that caused all these problems. And, I don't know if that's necessarily 100% fair. And it really doesn't matter what the history is. What matters is what today looks like and what the future holds. And I think we're better as allies in certain aspects, particularly advocacy.
Oh, that's great. And I sort of echo a lot of those sentiments. So maybe talking about the future. So we've got the new laws coming in. We've got Taylor Swift coming to town.
Mhm. Yeah,
Looking
August in Toronto. Yeah,
and British Columbia too.
British Columbia. Yeah.
I was saying Vancouver is like demands up over 3,000% around those nights. So like, what could be possibly causing the spike? Of course, Taylor Swift. So, and then like 2025, like, is the CanStays Conference coming back?
CanStays Conference will come back. Yes.
That's
Yes.
great.
We have a bid out right now for venue, and we're looking at some dates, and I'm pulling a little bit of strategy here based on advocacy. So there is a federal election, October 2025. Technically, one could say it might be before then. I'd bet a lot of money it's not, just because of the way the deck is stacked in certain people's favor. So we're going to look at probably September, end of September, beginning of October, which, talking about Taylor Swift, as I've talked with political circles, I said, you cannot discount the fact that she's playing in Miami right before early voting or right as early voting opens in Florida, right? So there's a lot of strategies that when you look at some of the things that are taking place, so it's like, well, we can employ the same strategy. So we can do that too. So I think we're going to look at, more that end of September, just because I think it's easier too on the property managers. And there's a lot of event compression from our industry in April. I chose April because I was looking at a break week for Parliament. And because I did want them to come, and because there had been this federal budget announcement about changing in the tax regulations for short-term rentals, and they were going to vote on it, after our conference. So it gave us an opportunity to kind of have everybody's attention and be on this budget tour, if you will. And so that's why it was that period of time. But we don't want to have people choosing between this conference or that conference if possible. And that's more so on the vendor side than it is the property managers. But we want to have support from a number of folks that weren't able to participate this year, specifically folks that have interest in, say, EV charging stations and those types of things. We really want to see them participate because those are part of the outlook for Canada.
So, one, excellent to hear. So excited. Two, and now maybe pivoting away from the conference and like STR benefits consulting, we talked about it briefly at the beginning, but can you give a sense of what that is and why maybe anyone would need to think about benefits?
Sure. Well, I think there's a mix of employer groups within the short-term rental industry. There are large organizations, Airbnb, for example, that has almost 7,000 people on their plan. And there are smaller employers that say have 15 people on payroll. And there's been a wage and hour change with Department of Labor. So what you did consider a 1099 employee is most likely going to be a W-2 as of March 11th. So there was a big update there that people need to be aware of. And I just got back from VR Nation, and Sue Jones and I did a session, and she talked a lot about those changes that people need to be aware of. So as I was leaving my corporate job, and it really had to do with the transaction more so than anything else. I looked across the industry, and because I could see data and I could see who's got what carrier, who's got participation. There's a federal filing called the 5500 that I can look at and see how many eligible employees do you have, who's actually participating on the plan, and right away I know there's a cost problem. And I knew how to address that, how to reposition it, and I wanted to bring that skill set into the industry, and there was nobody else that was doing that. And so looking at how I could help people procure better benefits. And when I say benefits, it's not just healthcare, because there are certain organizations that can't afford to offer healthcare yet, but they can offer something else like, you know, disability insurance or something that is maybe even voluntary. But I wanted to be able to help with the education around that and help people negotiate contracts and be able to not leave money on the table if they didn't have to. And that isn't squeezing the employees, that's really squeezing the PBMs on the backside, the pharmacy management company, because your pharmacy contract is your lowest hanging fruit in terms of cost savings. So looking at those things, and then the number of individuals that were using the lowest cost payroll solutions like a QuickBooks or their own bank, where they don't get alerted to some of the state and regional regulations. And so you find that out by accident, that if you've got a plan and if you've got a VA in Washington state, that you're supposed to be paying into the long-term care benefit that the state offers. Well, QuickBooks isn't necessarily going to alert you to that. And then you have a compliance problem. So I wanted to help in those areas and take my 22 years of relationships and experience and say, let me help you.
So, who all should be thinking about this? Is it just property managers? Is it individual hosts? Like, do I need to be thinking about this like as I'm hiring like just 1099 cleaners? Like, does it vary by state? Like, what is the range of like who needs to be thinking about these sort of issues, or is it everyone?
Everybody needs to be thinking about the 1099 issue because it's a big change. So, the change comes with, and it's subtle differences. Like if you provide materials to them, if they're a critical component of your operations, which one would argue that a cleaner is pretty important. And most of us provide the cleaning supplies that the cleaner uses. And if they work for anybody else, if they have a business license, are insured, carry their own workers' compensation, sort of, there are scenarios where they do qualify as a 1099, but there's a lot of scenarios where under the new regulations, they probably don't. So anybody who has even one cleaner, you want to make sure that you're not out of compliance. And that's really Sue Jones's level of expertise, really on the HR side. The benefit side, I would also say anybody who has an employee needs to make sure that they're cognizant of this, because you have a timeline with an individual. Over the last 5 years, I've aged. My life has changed dramatically in 5 years. 5 years ago, I had a kid in daycare, and so that's very different than where I am today. And so my needs have evolved. Whether I've been prescribed medications, whether I need a surgery, whether I've hit certain age bands where we have to go through preventive testing. If you are an employer that is saying, I'm just too small to be able to offer that, then you need to understand you're basically setting a cutoff date for when that team member can stay with you, because they have needs that they're going to have to move on to. And I think the interesting thing is we talk about non-competes and things like that. It's the concern is my team will go work for another property manager. And the real risk is, does your team member have a skill set that suits a different type of an employer? So, for example, a cleaner that goes to work for a hospital or a long term care facility that does offer those benefits. And so, where you have an employee who is a good employee, is a valued team member, and you as an employer want to meet them where they are, you have to have a strategic plan for where you're going with that. And the we're too small to offer benefits is not a sustainable solution. You're just going to churn through team members needlessly. You're also likely going to have workers' comp hits, because people will come in uninsured and needing to have some level of benefits. And we've seen the reports, and your workers' comp mod then is ridiculously high. So you're paying for it one way or the other. Better to be upfront and offering some type of solution to avoid that. If you're larger, even in the tech side of it, AirDNA, for example, or any of the other providers in this space, absolutely you should be looking at it, because there's opportunity. There's opportunity to say what should I be looking at from a cost savings perspective? How do I adjust some of these strategies to make sure that I'm not paying more in premium than I need to be, and it not benefiting my team members. So, that's one of the biggest challenges is you spend so much money in premium and nobody's excited when they have to access a health plan. So you feel as an employer, I invested, X amount of money in Catherine, and she's really bent about the fact that, it didn't cover this or it didn't cover that. So controlling that message and making sure that the dollars are being invested wisely and sharing with the team members all that you provide is really important.
Yeah, and at AirDNA, we've gone through such a transition since I've been here. Like when I first joined, we had about 40 team members, and 2 days after I sort of signed my contract to join, I found out that we were pregnant with our second kid, uh,
Yeah.
and sort of asked like, "Oh, what's the parental leave policy?" And one, we didn't have an HR department to ask.
Mhm.
So just like asked like our office manager, like, "Oh, what, you're actually the first person to ever have a kid while employed at AirDNA. Like, probably just whatever you can negotiate with the CEO." Like, and that was the policy. And fast forward today, we're almost up to 200 team members, and like we have been very proactive, and like we want to have a very generous parental leave policy to keep that, like so many people on there's this joke about the water in Denver now because uh so many members now are getting pregnant because, and we're sort of at that point of a company where people have been with us for 3, 4, 5 years, and they're sort of reaching that age. And it is like, are they going to continue, or are they going to leave and find a company that will provide those benefits now that they want in the next phase? And we've made the decision that, and we want to keep these people, and we want to like
Mhm. Mhm.
really be able to compete on benefits. And that's a big part of retention. And and sort of
Absolutely.
setting the company up for long term.
Absolutely. And so what's interesting when you're in that lane is like understanding the cause and effect of everything. Because you can go from we offer subpar to mediocre benefits to we offer amazing benefits, and then your plan can actually explode because you're getting adverse selection. People are taking the job because they know what they're going to get out of it and they don't intend to come back. And so figuring out how do you balance all of those things together, and that really is my specialty. That is where I can have a lot of fun because I've done that for large employers where you look at this and you say, what is the leave policy? How does the leave policy speak to the disability policy? And understanding how all those different contracts, because parental leave doesn't help you if you need an ACL repair. But so if you have disability in place, if it doesn't speak to a leave policy for parental leave, you can have somebody getting 160% of their pay out on leave, and then you will be joking about the water more so in regular because people are taking that position for that. And so you can adjust contracts to make sure that they work to your benefit. And every employer is unique in how they do that. And you have to understand the makeup of your team members. Like I had a group that the majority of their team members that they hired were disabled military, like ex-military that had been put out on disability. So they're getting a disability payment every month from the VA or whomever. And if your disability policy doesn't acknowledge that, they'll never get paid disability from the salary that they're getting paid. So, you have somebody who's been in an accident and has lost a limb, but they're a secretary or a VA or whatever. If they're counting on that income and then they go out on disability, you as an employer have lost credibility because you said they had this benefit. And so it's protecting that employer brand with the benefits too. And that's looking at, do the contracts pay what we've said they would pay? Do we allow worksite vendors to come in and disparage our plan? A lot of people will use some of those worksite benefits, like an Aflac, to come in, and the first thing they have to say is your plan's not good enough. If you get cancer, your plan won't pay, and this is why you have to buy X. And so, being really protective about what you allow into your organization so that your brand is protected within that benefits program as well.
Is there something unique about short-term rentals that sort of causes people like if you were running a property management like and maybe you were in another industry, like so many people in this industry are like, are there things sort of unique to short-term rentals that are sort of things you wouldn't have to think about maybe at other type of companies?
Well, I think you have a higher rate of seasonal employee. I think it's you get two fractures where you've got people who don't invest in benefits at all, and then you get individuals that are overly generous. So, you know, in all my dealings with large employers across 22 years, I had one client that paid 100% of family coverage, and it was a huge nonprofit that was a national organization. And within the short-term rental space, there's actually a lot that do pay 100% for family coverage because they are trying to recruit and retain those team members. So I think you would never see that in another industry, but I think in part it's because of the amount of, and they tend to be the higher end property managers where they don't have the capacity for the turnover because they need to know the person that's coming in for a six-figure reservation, like you've got to have the maintenance staff that knows what they're doing. You can't have that constant turn versus somebody who's, charging $65 a night for their rental. Like it's the same level of interest in terms of how they take care of their team members. I think in a traditional private or even nonprofit perspective, it's really just about bottom line, and they don't view their team members necessarily as people. They're just line items on a spreadsheet. And I think this industry views that very differently. And I do think it is because of what we do.
Well, that's super interesting. So, Catherine, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Going into this, like I didn't know I was going to learn so much about benefits consulting. uh, Again, such a great conference. So glad that you're going to do it again. Looking forward to finding out more about it. And then, sort of, if people want to connect with you, and how can they do that?
I'm very active on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way. And my contact information, if we're connected, is there. So find me on LinkedIn. It's Catherine Ratcliffe. And yeah, I'd love to connect with people.
Awesome. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, Jamie.